crazy because it's really weird. Anyways, how do you do? And you're a very nice-looking fellow, and I looked at your site and saw your stuff and talking to people, so I figured, I guess he's going to be nice to me.
Do you get nervous just meeting people in general, or is it just having the pressure of having to hold the conversation?
You know what it is? It's that I have so much in my mind. I have a lot. And so I get really nervous about making sure that I don't get too confused. And I never do. But it's just part of my makeup, I've always been an extroverted person when I'm on.
Right.
And when I'm not, I am an ultimate introvert, and I can't even imagine talking to somebody else.
Right.
So it's really strange. Yeah. So we have that, but nervous because I want to say what's interesting, and what we would. I mean, I sort of have a little idea of what I wouldn't mind sort of going into and stuff like that.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like we're both interested in talking about the same thing, which is.
Lighting right?
Yeah, it looks good. Maybe if you could turn maybe the camera a bit down so that you're. There we go. That's probably better. Yeah.
All right,
perfect.
Great.
That's great.
So people can see that at least I can read. Yeah.
So yeah, it sounds like we're both interested in talking about the same thing, which is what's going on right now. How do you understand what's happening in the world?
If we want to talk about today, I think I'd like to talk about yesterday first, how we got here, and what our entire kind of global ethos has been, especially and focusing in on Western civilization, because that's the area in which I have knowledge. One thing I do know about Buddha is that he and Socrates were around in the same time, which I find fascinating because we had the East and the West, and nobody really knew until we got into the future, where we look back and went, oh my goodness, these fellows were actually born and being influential in their philosophies at the same time. So the East and West philosophy began back in about 500 BCE. And the reason I wanted to bring all this up, this historical stuff, is because if we go back, to the origins of what is called the Pisces Age, because of course we don't know for sure when it started, and it's an awfully big number to start sort of trying to be precise. However, about 2,600 years ago, 2,160 years ago, the Pisces Age would have begun. Now that or really initiated a period that was related to the downfall of the Minoan period, which was the feminine era, and gave rise to the Mycenaean era, which was the era of warriors, because it associates itself with various wars, but also too with the most spectacular, of course, was Troy. And then the eruption in Thera in Greece, the volcano, and the Minoan culture that was very lively and very rich and very much alive in that time frame during on Crete. And Crete was the center of the Minoan culture at the time. And then, as they would have it in the classics, the sky gods descended from the north. Okay, so we have to assume the north is Germany. Okay, so it's the Teutonic gods. So we end up with these Teutonic gods who have usurped, the feminine goddess worshipping culture. And all of a sudden we have 2,160 years of hell when it comes to women. Because I actually rang my daughter. She's always really good, because if I'm nervous about something, I talk to her, and we end up talking about things that are loads of fun, and she distracts me. So she's really, and it's surprising to me, quite a feminist. And I wasn't really aware of that. I mean, she's 48, and so she says, well, has it always been like that, Mom? And I said, well, I think in our epoch, yes, it has always been like that. In other words, like that being that women are denigrated, that they're not very bright, that they should just be decorations, that they're, in fact, in the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, when the the popish people got together and they were creating laws. One of the laws was that women were declared in this Council of Nicaea as soulless beasts. So we didn't have a very good start to this era. And the era naturally has covered vast global conflict. It's not all about the planetary array. I mean, to try and sort of say that Uranus or Pluto or Neptune are in some way responsible, I have a problem with that. I don't believe in planets being, let's say, sentient in any way, that they should have a plan. However, having said that, there seems to be some very interesting uh, uh, experiences in Western civilization, and I have to stick to that because, she said, "Was it like that, my daughter? Was it like that in China? Was it like that in India? Was it?" And I'm going, "Yeah, actually, it was because it was a man's world at the time, and globally it was." And obviously, there were instances where the feminine had its own because they would keep and indeed even like in the Arab cultures, women weren't always treated the way they are today, but they never had a position of any power.
And
So,
I think I can't remember if it's the Algonquin or the Iroquois, but didn't they have the grandmother's lodge that was the final say
yes,
on anything? I guess some cultures,
yeah,
like you're saying, were a little more advanced as far as understanding the dynamics and the strengths.
exactly. There have been. And, even in ancient Greece, where, there's a really famous dialogue called the symposium, where all these Socrates and his mates are all sitting around, lying around on couches and drinking, because that's what a symposium was you got wildly drunk and then you spouted philosophy. And that brought some, I'm sure, some very interesting moments in time, which we don't know about because they didn't tell us what they were really doing. But what they were doing was they were trying to, in the symposium, at the very, very core, was a dialectic between love, like what of the two kinds of love. And one of them, very revealing, was love of a. There was two goddesses. There was Aphrodite Pandemos and Aphrodite Urania. And Aphrodite Urania was the daughter of this of Uranus. So she was the higher mind, okay? But Aphrodite Pandemos, which means of the people, literally, she was the one that you would be, you know, ruined by, because you would be sucked into sexuality and babies and household duties and a nagging woman and blah blah. I mean, it's absolutely hilarious. Everyone should read it at some point. And then you'll become deeply outraged, but at the same time very amused. And so there we were, 5th century Athens. But it was in 5th century Athens where I think we really reached a place in life, in the collective consciousness, where volition comes in. In other words, the gods didn't make me do it. If a man rapes a woman on the way to the bread shop, he could go to court and say, Zeus made me do it. And they'd say, oh, right, of course. Yeah, well, can't help it that, can we? Well, it was the tragedians. It was the Sophocles and Euripides and Aeschylus, all of the ones that wrote the tragedies. They were the ones that introduced psychology into the Western mind by actually introducing the possibility of volition, that you actually have a choice, that you're not just driven by some insane God that wants you to, take the head off or start the war in Sparta or any of that stuff. Um, so volition became very important during that period. I wrote a paper on it, so I mean that to me was consciousness. And so when consciousness came in, that was around the time that there would have been in the eastern part of the world, in the Buddhist world, a concept of consciousness. And so there was two warring factors essentially. And so I think there's been religious wars on and off all through this age of Pisces. I mean, in a book called the Theogony, which is basically the begats of the gods, and it's written by Theognis, and what it is, it tells the story of how we got to the place where we reached a point of no return. And there's something called the degeneration of the metals, like gold to silver to bronze to copper to iron. And in this, the fellow, he was crying the blues because he was born in the age of iron, and that it was the deadliest, bloodiest period of time, which is the age of the Greeks, and going back from now about sort of 2100 years, and that it was that we were doomed, by this being born in the age of iron. Didn't go on to tell us what the ages was going to be. They never do they? They're never very helpful that way. They don't tell you, well, don't worry about it. Next time it's going to be really wonderful. It's the sunshine and all of the flowers and everything will be there. But so, everybody for thousands of years has been trying to argue their way around, human nature. And human nature does have anger. I mean, it has Mars, it has Aries, it has metals, it has all the makings of weapons, same things that will support houses. So we're looking really at what seems to be now what Hegel called life is nasty, brutish, and short. And I've often laughed and thought, I wonder if I were to do a seminar called Life is Nasty, Brutish, and Short, how many people would come? Yeah? Do you think it's sort of an attractive title? I thought nobody would come. Maybe they'd come because they thought it was going to be funny, and it would be. But yeah, I think that what we've really had here is a global epoch of which they change about every 2160 years, and the total full cycle of it is about 26,000 years. So we're looking at really big time scales. But what we're coming to now, I think we need to talk more about what our social situation is, knowing that there's been some ancient mindset developments that are stuck within our brains and our minds that are embedded in there. And that basically it's been a warrior epoch. Prior to that, it was a feminine-based, goddess-worshipping culture. And that didn't mean that you didn't have to kill animals to eat, but they were worshipped. Participation mystique was about being at one with nature. People don't even understand what you're talking about. If you say, I'm at one with nature, they just say, idiot, and keep moving. Yeah, oops, careful. Person doesn't know what they're doing. And so if you start sort of muttering these things on the street, try it sometime, see what happens. Life is nasty, brutish, and short. Or, or the Minoan period, men didn't kill women. And the Greeks were respectful. I mean, they all had their hetairai, who were much higher educated than the men. Yeah, it wasn't about, the education all came from the women. But they were the kind of women that did not seduce you into the pandemos of the people woman. It's the Uranian brain from everything from the brain up, that kind of woman. But we don't even have any respect for that now. We don't see that today. I wonder what is going on.
So it's a matter of women finding their natural power?
Yeah.
and taking that role into the world. Is that what you see?
I think what's going on right now is absolutely amazing as far as the West. It's Western civilization. It's also going on in the Palestinians, in the Muslim religions. It's going on in Pakistan.
Saudi
It's going
Arabia.
on all over the world within its own context. But we're Western people. We know more about what's going on in our context. But this is not just going on in the United States and Canada, for example, but it is going on everywhere. And in its own quiet way, women allowing themselves to be put to death in other cultures and so on, as an example of how to be brave and strong. So we're in a time where there's a real enmeshment of gender that hasn't quite individuated out into a real match, where you find the masculine side of yourself and the feminine side of yourself working together. Like, for instance, you create these shows. Now, the feminine side of your psyche imagines it and has this all in their head, and it's like, oh, this is exciting and brilliant and it's all just an idea. And that's the feminine function. The masculine function within you and within me is, great, so what are you going to do with it?
Right. Action.
And I'm struggling with my masculine function right now because I have a new book and it's a fabulous idea, but I haven't been able to give myself that discipline, the masculine side of my brain saying, okay, now you have to write the first chapter and then a couple of, introduction and your back and all of this stuff. And I'm going, oh dear, I'm too tired, I to do it. So, we're in a mess and, absolute mess. I mean, I think that the real sort of consciousness change on planet Earth started to really move in a collective sense as far as East meets West and more communication between, say, the Eastern part and philosophies and the Western part and philosophies around the time of the sighting of the new planet Uranus. So we're looking at some planets. So we might want to talk a bit about those too, but you may have some questions for me.
Well, it seems like you were saying, conflict seems to be a part of our innate experience as an organic being.
Yeah.
Now, as far as being above the story, being in the story is the experience of it that each of us use to individuate. But being above the story, what is the purpose in your mind for conflict? I mean, you wrote a book on Saturn, and Saturn I have Saturn exactly conjunct my moon. And one of the first books I read was Liz Green's Saturn: A New Look at an Old Devil.
Oh right, yes, right.
And
that was her first. That was her first book too. Saturn was my first book, so we're old friends.
Yeah, and like when I was 14 or 15, I was having a very difficult time with life, and reading that book gave me a new understanding of what pain was about, and what implosion and what contraction is all about, and it gave me a new perspective on that experience. As opposed to repelling it, I embraced it as a challenge of awareness. How do you see conflict and what it means for consciousness of a human being?
I think consciousness is coming to terms with the divergent aspects of the self, and therefore, within the individual, all right, and we're looking at it from a fairly benign viewpoint. When it isn't integrated, let's say, into the whole of the system, as you described your adolescence, let's face it, that was when Saturn was opposing itself, and it's the old guard. It's like you were arguing and fighting with the father within, which inevitably would have meant your father suffered terribly himself, knowing that you were having the same kind of stuff that he went through. And so the conflict is natural. I mean, the polarities are important to have. And I think that what they lead to ultimately within the person as an evolutionary cycle is it leads to the acceptance and the recognition of otherness, that of accepting otherness, and that this is where we socially, in a global sense now, otherness is absolutely horrifying. It's not even interesting. I'm fortunate enough to have gone to as many countries as I would love to go to, and some of those countries they're rebel now, rebel. And so their negotiation within themselves about conflict doesn't have a whole lot to do with spirituality. It has to do with getting rid of, killing, uh, annihilating this whole feeling of difference and opposition. I mean, when we go back to Western civilization and its sort of Christian religion, and it's split, and 500 years from now, from previous was the Jewish, and then Muhammad came in around 600, and so what we ended up with was a conflict that was inherent, but also I think it was also induced. That it was induced by individuals, leaders, okay, who actually had not even a sense of their soul. So essentially it's being out of touch with the soul, because the soul doesn't have a gender.
So do you see there being an overriding and overwhelming consciousness that even those unconscious people are at the bidding of some other awareness? In other words, is there purpose behind everything in your mind?
I would have to say yes, and but not to get silly about it. All right, because like not everything is purposeful. Like spilling coffee down the front of your white dress just as go out to dinner. This does not make any sense. This is not important. but conflict is important. I think it's extremely important because it's the meeting of opposites is the mysterium conjunctio. It's like when we get to the blending and to the unification of opposites, we end up with a whole thing, as opposed to two separate things that are butting heads. And so, I mean, this is what Carl Jung was really deeply invested in. I mean, Carl Jung was very likely and self-admittedly bipolar. I mean, he had personality 1 and personality 2. And his personality 2 was the one that struggled, that did all the work that, about the unconscious and the supraconsciousness, and his whole ideas about the conflict within and the conflict without. And so he would have seen, the feminine function as being, the part of the self that actually got things done. And the masculine function as being the part of the self that really, that forced things to actually manifest. And so the marriage of the two masculine and feminine functions results in this holism. And I think that we achieve that periodically, individually. We'll find that in the course of a day, and it's like wonderful because it doesn't last. It's a state of mind and a state of consciousness, so it floats. But I think that we're looking at the death of this age of Pisces, which of course is ruled by sin and suffering. I mean that is the sort of subtitle for Age of Pisces is three sky gods under none, and a lot of conflict. And in order to actually come to terms with this very latter part of the cycles of the zodiac and over the long period of time. So I think there's definitely a purpose to conflict. I don't think there's a purpose to what's going on right now. I actually don't. It seems like it's gone completely over the top. That there is no rules of engagement. There's no enemies. There are no allies. There are no no descriptions of there's nobody running the show. It's what I call street war. Yeah, these are just guerrilla warfare, and so there doesn't seem to be much sense to this at all.
You don't find that in some ways that the pressure is greater than ever on the individual to make sense without the help of outside, because all the outside institutions are, like you say, kind of crumbling and being shown to be corrupt from within. That the pressure is on an individual now to make sense of the world from their own center. In a way, do you see that maybe that this is an opportune time for that?
I think that's really interesting. It has crossed my mind, but the way you've put it is very, very good, very interesting. Yeah, because I was just, to sort of kill a bit of time, I was checking my Facebook and I'd written something, and a woman said, "But what am I supposed to do about this chaos out in the world?" And I thought, terrific lead into the talk today. And I said, well, what you're doing, because she described looking after her kid and, doing these wonderful things and periodically finding herself meditating. And I said, what you're doing is exactly what we're supposed to be doing. We're supposed to be find the center within the self and not introject the collective psychosis. The minute we introject it, we start to project it outward, and it brings our warrior out, our sword unsheathed. And so I think that this sort of the New Age movement I've always thought was a bit sort of funny and silly. However, I don't think that it's irrelevant. I think it's very important. I myself find solace in the classics and in certain kinds of meditation, things like that. But I can't accept certain throwaway things like, oh, well, if you just do this, then it'll all go away, because that's not true. But what we can do as individuals is to become increasingly more integrated within ourselves and, don't have to tell people we're doing it, but our behaviors will show that we're doing that we aren't, going to attack, or that we're too sensitive or things like that. So I think that it's entirely at this stage up to the individual to make the change.
Yeah.
Big news. But look at how they're doing it. I mean, when you think just in terms of the sexual issues that are going on now.
Right.
No, that's been going on since the beginning of this whole epoch, yeah?
But it's all coming exposed.
It's hilariously, fantastically, amazingly, just all of a sudden it just blew up, and it was like, it was like that movie. Remember that movie in the sort of 60s, or I'm fed up and I'm not taking it anymore.
Right.
Everybody in New York throwing open their windows and saying, "That's it, I've had it." Yeah, sort of. So it's really like that people are throwing open their windows and saying, "I've had it," and so they're fighting, which is good, yeah, because it's a positive step forward. There's nobody's shooting anyone. No women are shooting any of these people that they're accusing of having done, really wrong things to them. And so, it looks like we could have a peaceful war actually going on, which I would approve of wholeheartedly, and that it's got to be taken seriously, because it will riot. It will riot in the end, and they already have shown that with those funny little pink hats and so on. So the women's revolution is finally coming about, which is kind of interesting, because in the suffragette period of time, like in the mid-late 1800s, when Uranus got sighted, the suffragettes chained themselves to the Parliament buildings, and they sang the song of Medea, who was one of these Greek authors, Medea, who sang, her song was, "A woman is never of her own. She is always her husband's or her mother-in-law's child." And they sang that to the stranger in her own land, and so on. And I think that's exactly what they foresaw, and they did. And the interesting thing is, the researcher in London was doing research for a women's group on the suffragettes, and he was also an astrologer. And I was writing a book called Retrograde Planets, and I was writing about Mars retrograde, and there was this damn jackhammer going off outside. I was going nuts because in England they just come over and they start crashing up here. So they're just not very civilized when it comes to workers. And so I was like out of my mind. I thought, well, this is perfect. Mars retrograde. Well, there's a jackhammer going on. So I went up to the bookshop, and this fellow was in there, and he said, "What are you doing, Erin?" And I said, "Well, I'm writing a book on Mars and on retrograde planets." And I tell him my little vignette had gone on there, and he says, "Well, that's really interesting because I've been doing a research job for women who are doing work on the suffragette period." And naturally, he got all of their birth data, and he found that the majority of them, beyond the sort of statistical average, had Mars retrograde.
Oh wow!
I know, and so it's sort of like it takes a Mars retrograde to start a war, and whenever Mars is retrograde in the heavens, there's always some kind of real clash that takes place. About every couple of years, it starts to get pretty dangerous, as if we aren't there,
Right.
on a daily basis now. Yeah.
Do you
So
find
there's a
that?
lot of
Do you find that right now there's it's an intense period astrologically with Saturn at its galactic center conjunct the Sun on the solstice, and a bunch of things sort of happening around this next few weeks? Do you find this a very intense time?
I do. I happen to be looking on my my screensaver, which has an horoscope that changes every couple of minutes. And yeah, there's the thing that I was worrying about the other day from my own feelings, just how I felt. I thought, I looked at Mercury and Saturn. I thought that's not good enough, and people laugh at me because I am a master astrologer, and yet sometimes I don't even know when Mercury's going to go retrograde. Yeah. All right. Well, guess what? Mercury is going retrograde. Is standing still. Okay, and it's conjunct Saturn. It's moving back to Saturn. It's been like this for a week and a half of building toward, and now it's going to be like that. And it looks like a very explosive period of time where we won't know for sure because the sun in the sky is squaring Neptune, which is the invisible made visible only through manifestation of something like music. You can't see music, but if somebody has a guitar, they can play it and then you hear it. So we're looking at something that isn't yet known. We're looking at something that is unseen. We don't know where it's coming from or where it's going. And there will probably be several heads roll in this. They've been rolling for weeks now, but I mean, there'll be a lot more. So we really are in a time where people are probably more, I think, feeling depressed, incapable of action. They don't know quite what to do. If people somatize it or get ill, this is not uncommon. A lot of times that will happen. Somebody can only express their rage or their anger or their helplessness through their body, through their soma. And so I think that we are right now in a time where there's a lot of danger, and I don't know that it's going to immediately affect us, but it will affect the long run because Saturn always has to do with time. So it'll be time. There will be a long run of serious difficulties, and heads will roll.
Right. Well, that's what I really appreciate about Saturn, and also appreciate that's why in this project I bring up conflict a lot, because it's at the core of our experience here in many ways. I mean, there's much more than just conflict, but if people understood conflict and understood Saturn as the route to mastery, as opposed to the route to pain and suffering, I think that that little switch of understanding of what they're experiencing would be the difference between not having to go through pain and suffering, but understanding that it's the friction that of their own spirit that is creating more friction, and that by going through that friction, they can learn how to release the friction and flow.
Right.
And isn't that the promise that Saturn offers with creating friction? Is that how you see?
Yeah. Well, Saturn is friction because it's the grindstone.
Right.
isn't it? I mean, that's how, and also it's it rules things that refine things like diamonds.
Right.
I mean, the diamond in the rough is one thing, but boy, I've watched in South America or in Brazil. Actually, I went to a showing. I watched a man make a diamond, and so it's the friction,
Right.
and that's the whole sort of corpus oppositorum. In other words, the body has to go in its opposite form in order to be able to accept. Like women have to become a lot more masculine in the sense of getting it out there, saying what they think, doing what they do, busting people if they have to. And men need to get more thoughtful, more
Abstract.
tender, yeah, and more gentle when it comes to their approach to things. More, I think, I think thoughtful would be about the best word, rather than just flying off the handle. So conflict has always been with us, but in some religions, conflict is the whole point. I mean, in the Buddhist religion, conflict is a gift,
Right.
because then it gives you the chance to meet your opposite. As I say, this business of oppositorum. Right. It's very important to have that conjunctio of the meeting of opposites that comes into some sense of peace. Now, again, it's not going to be like walking around like an ascended master all your life, but the fact is you will have achieved a new level that will stick with you. It will stick with you. And then you achieve it again and again, and you keep doing it. And I think that's the work. That's what we do.
Have you read Carlos Castaneda?
The whole collected works is there. Yeah. I've read him, yeah.
Because one of the there's two sets of books that have influenced me. It was Astrology when I was very young, and then Carlos Castaneda when I was about 16 also shot me off into a direction of understanding what's happening in this world. Because I grew up just not understanding what was going on, but feeling completely self-absorbed in it all.
I understand. I totally get where you're coming from.
So with Carlos, what I learned from Carlos, those books, or what it gave me the awareness of, was that the conflict that you're talking about, there's the inner conflict that once you get through that, I guess that's the Buddhist conflict as well. And then once you've sort of come to some understanding with that, then there's actually recognizing where you are in the cosmos to some degree.
Yes.
Not that that's necessarily conflict, but it's challenge. And is that what you see as an astrologer, the difference between evolutionary astrology versus personality-centered astrology, where you've kind of transcended your personality of astrology, and now you're into maybe more what you wrote about the outer planets and maybe Saturn, the influence of that is reflected in those planets?
Well, interestingly, at my stage, it's really important at my stage, it's really important that we, that I understand, because for some reason I've had a series of interviews in the last 8 days, and one of them was, how did you get into astrology? And it was because I was looking for something, and I was looking for something that would be, I didn't know what I was looking for. Let's put it just like you said. I mean, I don't know. I was just looking, and I was about the same age, 16, and I was on my own, and I was at art school, and I was always called toward. I always believed in something that wasn't what I got at my first communion in the Church of England. Yes, when I was. I guess 13. Yeah, I got my confirmation. I did take my first communion, and then I never went back because there was just nothing there, nothing. Mm-hmm. And my grandma was happy there as long as I got myself, properly, wetted and everything was fine, then I'd be fine. And so from there, I started seeking for some kind of religion. I mean, I was really looking because that was the only contents I knew it in. And I went into a bookstore in Vancouver, British Columbia, which is where I'm from. And it was called the Yoga Vedanta because I was attracted by the smell of incense coming out the door. So you can imagine what it must have smelled like in the early 60s. And I go in and I find a book, And this book is like everybody that's my age is one of the first books they ever read, and it's Ronald Davison's Astrology. And as soon as I started reading it, I knew that I'd found what I was going to do. And I also was already countering some of his ideas and thoughts. And then I read about my own sign, Scorpio, and I thought, it can't be that bad. Now I know it is. In its own way, yeah. Only you just play it differently, yeah. So I had to laugh. And so from the time I was 16, I was seeking, in fact, from the time I was 4, I was conscious that there was another plane, that there was another place to go. Partly because I needed to do that, and the other part was that I was by nature inclined that way. And so I found that to be very active when I was in my teens. And ever since then, I have studied and studied, and there's very little that I have not looked at, okay? And so I have no school of thought, which is always kind of bothers people. They're not really sure what to do with that. And yet I teach classes for the Evolutionary School of Astrology. I love it. I'm doing one on the 21st on death, the life of death. And which ought to be cheerful and fun. Actually, it will be because, I start off with the seasonal deaths, just to go easy at first before dying. And so, and I've looked at the Vedic system. It doesn't work for me. I'm a Western mind, so it's not my way of thinking, although I know how to do it. And so I've looked at all different kinds of astrology and then psychological astrology, basically founded by Dane Rudhyar, and then, became very psychological with Liz and her Jungian input, Liz Green. And I taught for them. But you see, I've never ascribed to, I don't want to name myself. This was one thing that I always struggled with as a not very well-known astrologer, but still well-known in the astrology groups, right? I didn't know what to call myself because I wasn't anything.
Right.
I was just an astrologer who was looking at everything. And I'm still like that. And so I don't have any problem with anybody else's stuff unless I don't know how to do it or I don't want to.
Right. So you use your own alignment with it to whether you integrate it or not.
Absolutely. Right. Yeah. I mean, at 70 and of 50.
Well, I got to say, you look awesome for 70. You're a beautiful woman, and I would never have guessed 70. You're 70 years old. You have good spirit, obviously. That
I have good spirit, and I guess I have good genes.
Yeah, good genes. Yeah.
I'm pretty honest. Yeah, so I don't tell them any lies to myself or other people. So I think that helps.
Yeah.
I mean, I have also. I mean, one thing that runs in our family is black humor. Yeah. And being a Scorpio, and we've got Pluto and Scorpio all over our maps in my family. So we run into this sort of thing of you're not really dead, Mom. You're just tired. We're all very dramatic, so we've all learned how to deal with that kind of stuff. But yeah, so it's been 54 years since I bought my first astrology book, and I taught myself how to do a horoscope. And then when I found out that Margaret Hone wanted to set 14 steps to get the sidereal time, AM or PM, I actually created a 4 steps way of doing it. So I actually found my own way. I think I was born to do this. I mean, I think if I know anything, which I don't, and I promise you I don't, about life patterns and reincarnation or other lives, it must have been part of something because I was born with it. I was measuring the movement of the sun when I was 4 with a stopwatch.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, so I was definitely.
You found your predilection. Yeah. Speaking of death, another thing that sort of changed my view was from reading the Carlos book was the concept of death. They call it the definitive journey. So for them, their goal. That from how I understand it, their goal is the retainment of individuality of consciousness past the organic realm of having a physical form and continuing their evolutionary journey. Is that something that you personally is that when you talk about death, is that a part of your understanding of death?
It is, indeed, because I've actually had the honor of attending two people who actually died right there. They have been sick for ages. One was my mother, and the other was a really, really, really great astrologer, Howard Susportis, who was my closest friend. And so I watched both of these people whom I loved and was present at that exhalation, because everybody takes their last breath. Well, they don't take their last breath, they breathe it out. And so as both of them, I'll speak to Howard at this point, he opened his eyes and he looked at me and breathed out. And I went, damn, I'm never going to know. He saw something and he wanted to tell me because that's what we were like. And then I broke down. With my mom, it was the same thing. She had been a terrible person in her life, unfortunately. She really, really ruined her life with drink and drugs. And, but in a very straight way. I mean, she was like top car salesperson in Canada, the first one in Vancouver. She was like class act, but a drunk. I used to, like when I was in my 40s, I would never have said that in an interview, but now it doesn't. Who cares? We all come from dysfunctional families. Looking in my mom's eyes, as she opened them, again, it was the same thing. She was like that, and then all of a sudden she opens her eyes and she looks at me, and she's about to say something, and she breathes out. And I went, wow. There's something, they see something. So there's something there. And so they told me that by their eyes was, hey, listen, there's something going on over here. And, you're going to have to wait. Too bad. The fun stuff, is going to be, later.
Right.
So I believe that there is, I can't believe that because we're talking about belief now as opposed to, sort of philosophy. But my belief system is that we do live. And I'm not really sure about karma. Okay, that's too big of a concept for me. So I've never been a karmic astrologer. I don't like to use the word because it feels pretentious, as if I know something that I don't. Right. And that to me, I have too much respect for certain levels of religious experience because I don't have them. But I do have visitations. I do have people come, my parents and friends who have died, and I've experienced them. I know they're in the room. I know they're there. So I do know that there's a veil. There's a very thin veil there. Fortunately, that we can't see, because if we were to see all these people, it would be terrible. There's so many of them. There's more dead people than there are live people. I'd hate to have to see them outside in my courtyard. Be a bit shocking. But yeah, I do believe this.
So how do you understand archetypes? Because another thing that I like to explore with people here is the lineages that a human being entails. From my understanding, we have a biological lineage. We have genes. We have a lineage that's been passed on since the first person that started your line has gotten to you and your daughters.
Right.
There's a memory there that goes back linearly through time. There's also
absolutely. I call it the ancestral legacy.
Right, but you're also an archetype that is not linked to your family. That you carry on a line of the being that you are as an archetype. So for me, they're separate lineages. That represent separate aspects that make up the multidimensional being that we would be. Is that your understanding?
I think it is, actually, because like when I think of the archetypes zodiacally, I will use, for sake of convenience, if you will, the planets and their archetypal origin as gods. All right, and that's acceptable. And it works like mad, too. It really does work. I don't necessarily regale people with the gods in their horoscope, but I do mention a few things about Uranus being the god of change, and was the first one to be cited, and therefore there's an archetype lying within Uranus that was a revolutionary, because, Galileo actually first saw him. I wrote it down here. Galileo saw Neptune for the first time in 1612. This is carrying on with the archetypal idea. 1612. Well, it wasn't until 1781 that Uranus was actually sighted by Herschel. Now, the reason that Galileo couldn't see, or he did see Neptune, but he didn't know. He thought it was a fixed star because it was with Jupiter that was conjunct. Now, strangely enough, now these things don't happen by accident. There's some divine discourse going on here, because Jupiter and Neptune were exactly conjunct, and Neptune was retrograde. So look, it was kind of backing into Jupiter, and they were exactly in the same degree, 26 degrees. The second time Galileo saw it was it was in the next month, when both Jupiter and Neptune were retrograde, and therefore they were backing into, away from the same center, but at the same degree. And so there was no way he could separate the two, and there was no explanation, because the actual retrograde motion was known, but it wasn't as well known that he would have been able to see that Jupiter wasn't retrograde and Neptune was retrograde. And so the archetype emerges, I think, out of the origin of the first time that the planet is made conscious. Yeah, so astrology, when the planet is made conscious, like Uranus in 1781, all hell broke loose. I mean, it was like the Industrial Revolution, the American Revolution, the French Revolution. It was like the cotton ginny. It was the beginning of the machination of work. Boys didn't have to be shoemakers if they didn't want to be. Women were starting to get uppity, and as we tend to be, and it was like, it just broke everything, right? And so I have to say, gee, maybe the first time it becomes enlivened, that we actually can have a new archetype. So that would say, all right, but it had to be from some origin point. That's where thinking about the archetype as a prime stamp, or the first imprimatur, I guess that might have been at the Big Bang. I don't know. Right. Fortunately, there's a lot that I don't know, and I'm not dead yet, so I've got something to do. So I look at it, they say to my kids, "Well, I'm not dead yet, so I guess I better do something." Yeah, and then Neptune, it was sighted in 1846, so we've had one every century except this one. Okay. So Neptune was 1846. That was what began the whole integration of the East-West, when Madame Blavatsky and Brigadier General Fireberry founded the Theosophical Association, and they wanted to bring the East and West, when they got 12 sects of the Buddhists together, and they were going to get this whole thing and go over to New York. Well, of course, New York wasn't having a bit of it, so they didn't get to go. But they still got very involved with people like Mesmer, who was, mesmerized the hypnotist. And, it was the discovery of pain-killing drugs like cocaine. It was when they, separated the beginning of drug addiction was set in that time frame. I mean, that cocaine was a major problem for Freud. Right. Killed him in the end, really. Yeah. And then when we saw Pluto, in 1930, the woman who had discovered Marie Curie, the plutonium and radium, she died only a couple years after Pluto was sighted. But when Pluto was sighted, that was when the Manhattan Project began here in New Mexico, and that was the beginning of Fat Boy and Big Boy and Nagasaki and Hiroshima. So when I look at archetypes, I'm looking at planets and seeing how did they originate. So I do tend to be mythological. I look at it mythologically, and I'm happy with other people looking at them in different ways. But to me, it's I employ the gods. I call them in.
Aren't we all gods?
Yeah, within. Yeah. The God within, yes.
Do you subscribe to the concept that we are the cutting edge of awareness? It's an Abraham thing. I forget the name of the people that
Oh, that's interesting. A friend of mine just went on a tour on a big boat trip in Italy or somewhere with Abraham. I've never heard of him before. Um, I guess I'm a bit skeptical of. I don't really know enough to be able to tell people where it's really at. I mean, I'm very quick to say, this is what I know, and then I can lead you to a certain place like the horse, and there's the pond, and have a nice big drink, and from that you'll be nourished and so on. That's pretty much what I do, and people are very happy with that kind of work. I've never felt the need to name it.
Right. For me, it's like what you're mentioning earlier. It's like I don't have a particular philosophy that I particularly adhere to. I hear something, and if it resonates and aligns with something that seems like a perfect encapsulation of what I kind of sense. For me, the cutting edge of awareness is a nice point of what it feels like to be alive as a human being. It feels like the point at the light at the point of light streaming through the cosmos. You know what I mean? It feels like that's what being alive is.
Those moments are to be cherished. I mean, I think that's what enlightenment is.
Right. To
be enlightened.
Right.
To actually, and it's temporary. I mean, you don't get to wander about like that. I mean, I may perhaps there have been. There's not. I mean, the Dalai Lama certainly doesn't let people tell people he's enlightened all the time. He's busy looking at Rolex watches and pretty girls, and
right.
I mean, he's a real guy and an interesting man. Hell of a life. Whoa! In one of my courses, my one full class was on the Dalai Lama and his heroic journey, how they were looking for him before. And they found him just as Saturn was at his midheaven, like it's his heroic journey. But they'd been looking for him in the ninth house, which is like what seeking is when Saturn's transiting your ninth house. And it was just, he was seen and found when Saturn was at his midheaven, his call to adventure as his heroic journey. I mean, it's absolutely brilliant. The man's had a hell of a life, very difficult. And I think he really, really comes across as a person of enlightenment. At least a lot of flashes of it, anyway.
May I ask what not the details, obviously, but where you're headed? Like your new book that you have an idea for. Where is your attention headed?
Well, interestingly, the collective is sort of announcing it ahead of time for me. I have wanted to write this book for many years. Like, people ask me, how long did it take you to write a book? And I say 40 years to cook it and 7 months to write it. Yeah, that was Retrograde Planets. I mean, I went nuts when I wrote that. It was like a gift from God. Okay, so this one, I want to write a book. Its title will be Hades and His Ladies, and that subtitle is Resurrection of the Feminine. Now, I thought of that about 10 years ago. And that's all been cooking and cooking and cooking. And my masculine side's being really lazy. It's not, I've got my Inner Traditions Bear Company, criterion sitting up on my desk or behind me on the computer and looking into the horizon for the book. And I've got all my sort of mojo going. But yeah, it's basically about the Western civilization's treatment of women and what happened to women. And I'll be using a lot of the female archetypes from the goddesses of the ancient Greeks, not least of which, of course, is Hecate, who is the one who was the guardian of Hades' realm. And Hades wasn't a bad guy. I mean, he was just drew the short straw, just because, the other brothers got the heavens and the sky, Zeus, and the seas and Poseidon, and Hades drew the short straw. And he got the underworld with all the shades. And so that's where the whole myth of Persephone comes in and so on. But yeah, I'm going to be using a lot of archetypes. In other words, the archetypal feminine lying in the Greek mythological realm. And we'll see where it goes.
So do you just have to set yourself in front of the computer and just get going? Or how do you work in relation to getting focused and disciplined?
Well, very with a great deal of trouble these days, it seems. But I have done it 7 times, and I really ought to be able to do it now. Um, what's happened is the world's become way complicated, and I have so many pieces of paper that I don't know what to do with, and my place is clean, it's not dirty, but I'm surrounded by horrifying piles of pieces of paper that scare me witless because I am not an organized person when it comes to paper. I am very organized in the mind, but as soon as I look at this, oh, they're right over there looking at me. Anyway, what I do is I storyboard as if I were writing or making a movie or something. I actually have behind my computer blank pieces of paper, and I write anything that comes to my mind on certain pieces of paper. I may list. I may say have one for Uranus, one for the Sun, one for I'm not sure yet, but and I do that, and I have on my computer. I already start with working table of contents. The thesis. I start to make that are based upon the thoughts that I want to use, and so that I can start dragging ideas that don't sit for one. I can just pop it into the other, into the other folder. So for writing, when I get to it, I'm disciplined. Like I'll write for 10 hours solid, and make myself ill. I learned long ago that I should never read anything that I wrote the day before. Okay, I should give it a day. Because when I read what I wrote last night, it's crap.
Right.
If I leave it and I work on something else, I go somewhere else totally different and work on that today. And then the next day I'll read it and I'll go, wow, you're brilliant. This is fabulous. Right. So there's certain tricks to writing that an author has to get find for themselves, but I find that organization is really, really important. Right. That you can't just sit down and do it. One of my favorite quotes that I've got up here, and it says, it's of Keith Waterhouse, who is my favorite British playwright, and it says, the best thing about writing is having written. And I agree wholeheartedly. And he reminds me. So I have to write in order for it to be the best thing.
That's the thing.
Yeah, so Hades and his ladies. Yeah, it's not going to have any astrology per se, right. But obviously the archetypes, it'll come up. Right. I mean, it always comes up. Like I feel Hades and his ladies is a part of me that needs to get the feminist out of me without feeling that I'm being bad or embarrassing or anything like that, because I don't want to be. I just want to write this really cool book.
Well, I hope this interview has been pretty smooth for you. It felt like it was very. It
was lovely talking to you. You're very, very fun to talk to. I feel very responsive. Yeah, awesome. Thank you.
Good, and you as well.
All right. Well, listen, it's lovely to meet you, and I'm very impressed with all the work you've done. I looked through your site and saw your people and your studio, and I really like what you're doing. I think you're doing a good thing. Awesome. You're doing the right thing.
Thank you.
Well done. Okay, sir.
It's a pleasure to have met you.
A great pleasure on my part, too.